So thank you all for being here. It's such a joy to be here in Chennai for three reasons. First, the people of this wonderful city and this wonderful state are amongst the most generous and hospitable in the world. So it's a pleasure to be back here. Thank you. Of course, you're applauding yourselves. Second, of course, the food here is glorious in Tamil Nadu. So when I got the invitation to come, I had to not think twice about it. But third, this festival is always a joy. I came here around about 10 years ago, and amongst the things I loved most were that there were lots of young people who came to listen in the audience. How many people are, put your hand up if you are young or if you think you're young? Yeah, isn't that great? Okay, young people. But also after my talk, as I wandered around last time, I remember people coming up and asking questions for ages. So I'm not going anywhere. So if there are things you'd like to ask me at the end, I will be here, and just be patient and I will try and answer them. Right. I'm going to talk a bit about the environment, about nature, but also about history. Let me see. I'll be turning around a few times. Let's see if my slides work, first of all. Could I get my slide? There we go. Okay. Right. Here we go. Here we go. Can I move the chairs? Yes. Can we move the chairs? Yeah. Good idea. Actually, my back is gone. It makes me look like I'm not. Okay, good idea. Okay. Let's try this. We'll do it quickly. It doesn't have to be, it doesn't matter where it goes. How's that? Is that okay? Better, yeah. Great. I heard, by the way, that David Williams had a fantastic entry. So any ideas of good music that I should come on to when I speak, Lata Mangashkar or something that will keep everybody quiet and happy would be great. Right. So, the world that we think of around us is not the world as it's always been. This is what our planet looked like a few 100 million years ago. This is where the continents all were dispersed. I wasn't taught that in history lessons. I was taught about things that humans did starting about 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. But our beautiful planet is about 4.5 billion years old, and if you start by only thinking about humans, then you forget about the importance of the natural world, not only for us, but also all the other species that we share this planet with, all the ways in which we communicate. So it would be much easier for me to have got to Chennai from Oxford if the world looked like this. I could have even walked if I'd set off long enough ago. Who here who's young can tell me what this is? The moon. Who said the moon? Okay. This is why it's so exciting coming to talk to you here. This is not the moon. This is our planet. About 2 billion years ago, for half of our planet's history, the Earth was too cold or didn't have enough oxygen to keep our species alive. So we are all products, whether it's to do with your religious faith, scientific faith, and so on, of a whole set of coincidences that have shaped our world around us. Now, those of you who said the moon, the moon plays a role in our present and our past that we don't think much about. Every time the tide comes in and out here in Chennai, every time you worry about your flood defenses, that's not just because of tropical storms, that's because of the position of the moon. The moon shapes global tides because the gravitational pull of the moon helps move our bodies of water. It distributes the warm water towards the south and the north poles. The moon plays an important part in reproductive cycles. The moon plays an important part of dating cycles. Our months, this word month comes from the word moon, from Scandinavian, Old Norse. The moon plays such an important part in that world around us, such an important part of reproduction, not just of humans, but of all animals. This cycle of 28 days. There's a reason for it, and it's to do with things that we don't think about in our history lessons. Same way, you probably heard a bit more here in India and in Chennai, Tamil Nadu, about monsoons, how important the monsoons have been for trade, for connectivities. We see the winds which blow in one direction for 6 months of the year, and then 6 months in the other way. But those monsoons are also shaped by the locations of mountains, by natural phenomena that are all connected into very complicated global climatological patterns. The position of where mountains are, the Himalaya, for example, but also here of the Rocky Mountains, this band down the middle of the United States, switches the distribution patterns of water, not only in North America, but far beyond as well. So this mountain range of the Rockies is a barrier that shapes rainfall patterns in Norway and Scandinavia. If you look at this map behind me, you'd think that if you were going to grow fruit and vegetables, you'd probably want to grow them on this side of the United States. If you want to be worried about wildfires, for example, you should be worried about this part of the United States. And I've been talking about this for the last 3 or 4 years, partly because of my book, but also because I work on risks and global risks in policymaking and so on. And the exposure of California and Los Angeles to high levels of climate change and to wildfires was such that about 3 years ago, the big insurance companies in North America stopped providing cover for insuring houses in some parts of California. Same way that they've stopped providing cover for hurricane damage in Florida because the scale of these disasters is so huge. They are partly to do, as I'll explain, the ways in which humans choose to live, but these are things that are dictated by geological patterns that happened hundreds of millions of years ago that we don't think too much about. Here in India, one of the questions that you worry about, think about, is about your energy supply for your cooking, for your heating, for your powering air conditioning, for the lights in here. And one of the strange distributions of what happened 250 million years ago, 230 million years ago, was the formation of these purple things behind me, purple colors behind me. They are the world's great hydrocarbon basins where oil and gas is found. And through chance, here in India, you're quite poorly resourced. There is some oil, there is some gas, but nothing compared to, for example, the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, or Russia, which means that the ways in which Prime Minister Modi or his successors, his predecessors, had to think about India's foreign policy, economic policy, energy policy, have been shaped around the location of where these big fields are, which was created by a process of climate change that lasted hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years, of dead animals, dead trees, producing what now we can exploit for oil and gas in particular. That means that the ways in which the world around us today functions is different. You'll notice that China, also very low on its capacity and capabilities of fossil fuel independence other than coal. That's one of the reasons why there's been such a push towards renewable energy, both in India, but also in China, not just because of cleaning the world and having sustainable and cheaper energy, but because there's energy insecurity otherwise. It's fundamental to understand these things. And as it happens, here in the United States, North America, because of the new technologies, particularly with shale gas, North America, United States today, produces twice as many barrels of oil per day as Saudi Arabia. Most of us in this theater would think that the world's great producer of oil is in Saudi. The United States producing twice that much. So that changes energy prices in the US. That's why when you run presidential elections, you might want to think about how cheaper energy is important, more oil, drilling more. It's one of the reasons why people get elected into office in Washington. These things, they shape our world today. We don't connect those dots. The same way, it's not just about oil and gas. The way we think of, let's say, the United States, I'll say about India too, are to do with these big red dots, which are the major coal fields in the United States. Coal was the energy that powered the world from 1750, let's say something like that. Still powers it today. Look at India, look at China. But the distribution of these coal fields was the reason why railroads got built in the United States. These railroads weren't built to help people travel or to take Instagram photos or to get good experiences or to see local indigenous populations who are in the process of being relocated or exterminated. They were built to connect to coal fields. After they'd been connected to coal fields, they were built to expand to create connections to the Great Plains and to wheat fields that allowed food to be distributed to the east coast of America and then across the Atlantic. So by 1850, it was cheaper because of new technologies to ship wheat from New York, well, from the Great Plains, so round about here, Iowa, the Midwest. It was cheaper to get it from there to New York and across the Atlantic to London than it was to get wheat from Ireland to London. Short Irish Sea. So the railroads were built, connected to these great coal basins. This is the story of the railways in India. The rails were built, maybe we have a chance to talk with Shashi Tharoor about his views about what the British did in India, but empires, whether it is the British, whether it's the Chola, whether it's the Mughals, or the Romans, take a pick, empires are always about extraction. They try to get hold of resources and bring them to the center. And the story of India was, how do you get the things that people wanted, cotton and textiles, coal, wood, etc., etc. How do you bring them efficiently back to ports where you can export them? So the story of the Empire of Britain and its Industrial Revolution was to develop places like Bombay, or here, Madras, Chennai, into expanded, and of course Calcutta too, and then here Georgetown in Penang in what's now Malaysia, but above all about connecting to resources. And those locations of resources are why our cities have the populations they have today. There are very few cities that have been founded in the last 100 years. Mostly it's about accretion, cities that were already quite big, having more and more people coming to join them. This is how we think about history in a slightly different way, connecting it to the environment. So I promised you 4 billion years. I've covered, by the way, I think, 4.4 billion so far. I'm not going back anymore into geological time unless you want me to. But our species, humans, as we expanded out of Africa along these lines, they're a little bit, maps can be very helpful, but they can be unhelpful. People didn't take a train or start walking here from Lokitok up to the Arabian Peninsula and then stop or swim across, but people found new places to live as a result of finding the most agreeable locations to settle down. And that's not enormously surprising. All of us want to live in places that are sustainable. Chennai, on balance, is a more agreeable place to live than somewhere, let's say, in the middle of Saudi Arabia, where there's not one single river or one single lake. Much nicer to live here than in the middle of the Gobi Desert. So finding pockets that could sustain our life is the story of our species. And all of us, as we distributed over the course of hundreds of thousands of years from Africa, found different locations. Most of our common ancestors failed. Most of them died out. And there were many different human species too. Our own one, Homo sapiens, was the one that was most capable of adaptation and finding the best possible places to live, distributing eventually to places like Southeast Asia and to Australia around about 70 to 80,000 years ago, all driven by climate and natural factors. That starts to then explain why it is that these great settlements of early human civilizations are in obvious places. The Nile, which sits alongside the Sahara Desert and prescribed areas. So the Nile floods every year and produces these wonderful, rich soils that make Egypt the grain basket of the whole of the Mediterranean. So this was one key location for human civilizations to flourish. Another in the Levant here, another in Mesopotamia between these two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. Here I am, Indus Valley here, with the great waters coming down from the Himalayas, allowing people to be able to grow crops, have livestock, and have water and calories in large numbers. And then here, the Yellow and the Yangtze River deltas. There are other locations too, for example, in Central America and South America too. But these stories were ones of how people were forced into working together, because one of the things that all of these areas have in common, they're like funnels. So this is a good place to live with the Tigris and Euphrates, this big floodplain. But these mountains, the Zagros Mountains, are a much harder place to live. So they are like funnels, forcing people in together. Here in the Indus Valley, it was something very similar, with the Himalayas, much harder to cope with, the Pamir Mountains. But here, this wonderful bowl that allowed people to function together, high levels of population. As people built their cities, they thought about sanitation quite quickly. Our ancestors in the past were not stupid, despite what sometimes we teach children. We think we're the most intelligent generation ever to have lived. But here, in places like Mohenjo-Daro, you have sanitation systems, running water, sewage systems that are better than anything you find in many parts of the world until about 150 years ago. We'll talk maybe about the Indus Valley too, but what happens quite soon after cities, the first cities start to be built, these are all questions that you might want to ask me about later. One of the things that happens as cities start to build is hierarchies develop. Cities, when you put people together, generate inequality because some people's houses are bigger. Some people's houses are better located. Some people have access to better fields. Some people have more children or fewer children. But in most of the locations I talked about, you start to find royal structures, kings, leaders who want to work out how to provide justice. And that's not just because kings take power for themselves, although they do. Not just about ritual and status and being the person who gets to shape policy, although that's also true. It's also that structures and social hierarchies can provide justice. And people look to rulers to be able to work out who owns what for disputes. So quite soon after early cities, you start to find writing scripts in different parts of the world, including Indus Valley, here cuneiform from Mesopotamia, and the linear scripts from Crete. And that's at the purpose of that, of writing, is not historians writing their books, or novelists, or people giving advice. Then in the first instance, they're there to record ownership. They're there to allow states to be able to work out who should pay tax. And then you keep a record, and record keeping is the backbone of all history. Because when we have records, we can see what people were doing and what they thought they were doing and what they were thinking. And lots of the worlds I work on are nomadic peoples. People have oral traditions. And oral traditions, so when people pass on information through speaking, without writing things down, are often thought of by societies like ours, civilizations like ours. Civilization means people who live in cities. They're thought of as being unstructured and chaotic because they don't have memories, or they don't write things down. But in fact, oral societies are much more flat in their social hierarchies, typically, not always the case. By and large, people who pass things on are able to regulate themselves particularly well, but what history can do is it can also lock you in, like burying a coffin in the ground. You're then stuck. This is what we know, so we don't think beyond that. But the point of writing was to be able to regulate societies more fairly and deliver justice. One of the things that early societies start to do is to think about their engagement with the natural world, often to do with religion. I'll say a couple of words about this. But here we have a ruler in Lagash in Mesopotamia, where for 150 years, there was a war between neighboring states over water and land rights. So today we think of, and I'll come up to the present day, about water, the challenges of water availability, I'll say about here in India, but also about food. But this is a common human story, the worry about sustainability, the use of force to try to take over the best pieces of land for ourselves. This is something that goes back a very, very long way. When you have states that start to form, cities, you start having these defenses. This is a rebuilt part of the wall of the great city of Babylon. These walls are not built to stop being attacked, because these walls are much, much bigger than any technology that was capable at the time. These walls may have been built because kings, like Indian cricketers, they like to have the best car each. They compete with each other. Or anybody wealthy. You have a big flat-screen TV, I have an even bigger flat-screen TV. So states build these walls to compete with each other. That sounds to me perfectly plausible, because I know that even with my friends. When they get something, it annoys me, so I get one too. Slightly better. But also these walls usually have really important climate context. So walls like this can keep out dust storms. They can protect you from floods. But also the one thing that walls do very well, does anybody want to have a guess? Anybody young want to shout out, what do walls do? Most important, it's not to keep people out, it also keeps people in. So some of these cities are built with these big protective walls so that states can control labor, so that you make sure you have people who will build for you great cities, who will work in fields. And that structure about how cities can be oppressive, how they can be difficult, about labor rights, about workers, about workforce, about who controls human bodies from a point of view of sexuality and reproduction as well as labor, it's such an important way of thinking about the past. But also you then have, as well as kings and accountants and lawmakers, you have priests across all different global religions who want to try to mediate, to explain the role of the divine, of the God or the gods, and their relationship with our world. And across every single global religion, nature, the natural world, are absolutely critical. So in the sacred Hindu texts, the Sanskrit texts, the importance of rain gods, the importance of lightning, of thunder, of storms, the worries about drought, of famine, are central. In the Christian and Jewish and Muslim faiths, the story of the creation is about the story of the Garden of Eden. And the story of Garden of Eden is God puts man and woman inside paradise, from a Persian word meaning an enclosed garden. And everything in the Garden of Eden is perfect. Perfect food, everything you want to drink, everything is perfect. Wonderful climate conditions. But God gives one condition to humans, which is obey God's commandment. And when Adam and Eve eat the forbidden apple, the punishment is an environmental one. From that point onwards, people have to fear storms. They have to fear floods. They have to fear the baking heat. The story of Noah's flood, which we don't just know from the Abrahamic faith, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but also we know from Egyptian, Mesopotamian texts about catastrophic flood, was a way of God punishing humans for the way that they lived. And it's the same sort of negotiation with Buddhism about the natural world. Everything is going to die. With Hinduism, the role that Prithvi has, for example, the delivery of the monsoon rains, are connected by priests to the ways in which humans behave on earth. If you behave in a good way, you're rewarded with bountiful crops. If you behave in a way that is immoral, unkind, ungenerous, you'll be punished. We find this across every system. In Confucianism, in Chinese, the mandate of heaven that the emperor has, the ability to be able to negotiate the world around with the divine. And so it's not surprising that some of the early buildings that we find, and the most magnificent buildings we find in history, are temples. Here, for example, the ziggurats in Mesopotamia, or here, this is me in a hot air balloon above Teotihuacan in Mexico, just next to Mexico City. These enormous statements that show that humans are able to not control the climate, but they're able to intervene by speaking to God or the divine. And I suppose it's not surprising that when we look upwards into the sky, that's where this afternoon's rain that we have now in Chennai, or having tomorrow, that's where that comes from. It comes from the heavens. That's where the sun bakes down on us as well. That's where storms come from. That's where lightning comes from. That's all the things we can't understand. And of course, priests and religions play a really important part of trying to make sense of the world. And it's not exploitative. It's not just about an attempt to take power. It's about trying to use sciences to explain why do these things happen. And our ancestors, in whichever culture, civilization, in oral cultures too, try to make sense of how to see how humans should live in a sustainable way so that they can not have to fear climate and, of course, climate change. Right. Now, I'll give you a few wonderful stories and illustrations. This is, well, it's Elizabeth Taylor, actually. It's not Queen Cleopatra, but it's a great picture of a wonderful queen who you'll know about here because Cleopatra, of course, has a really strong connection to Central Asia and Northern India because her great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was a general of Alexander the Great who built left behind the Greco-Indian kingdoms. Cleopatra was the descendant of one of these generals called Ptolemy, who helped run Alexander the Great's empire afterwards. She was a fantastically clever woman. She spoke 7 languages, the first Egyptian ruler to speak the local language. But I will explain to you how, here's another picture. This is an English great tradition, the Carry On films. Anybody young won't have seen these. This is supposed to be Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. The point where Rome took over Egypt was not because they attacked Egypt because Cleopatra was a woman. We misunderstand that. The reason why the Romans took over Egypt and as a result opened up trade routes into the Indian Ocean, started to trade with the Kushan kingdoms here in the northern part of India, and then on the coast in places like Kochi too, but here in Tamil Nadu, Arakamedu, for example, which I went to last time I came here to Chennai. The reason that happened was that Julius Caesar, if I can go back to him, this gentleman here, was thought to be too powerful by Roman senators. And in 44 BC, two of them, Brutus and Cassius, murdered him on the steps of the Senate in Rome. And slightly ironically, around about the same time, there was a very large volcanic eruption in Alaska. Alaska's a long way away from anywhere. What volcanoes do is they eject vast amounts of aerosols up into the atmosphere, lots of debris, lots of dust. You'll have seen disaster films that show that happening. And what those can do is that those can block out the sun's rays, they can react with the moisture in the atmosphere to form sulfuric acid, and they can lead to very significant changes in global temperatures, but also to photosynthesis. And what happens in the years that after Julius Caesar's murdered is that the crops in the Nile floods fail. And as we know, because we've all had the experiences of COVID, of war in the last few years, when there is dislocation and change and problems, prices go up. Sometimes they go up because there is a shortage. Sometimes they go up because people are worried about a shortage. The cleverest person in the world is the person who made us all, I don't know whether you had that here in India too, worried about the availability of toilet paper during coronavirus, where they sold every single roll of toilet paper across the whole of the world because they told people we'd run out of it. That's actually true. I mean, it was true that they said we'd run out of it, but we didn't run out of it. And Cleopatra at that point had to negotiate the fact that she was a leader who was dealing with food shortages, price inflation, social unrest. So she made an agreement with one of the Roman generals called Mark Antony, hoping to stabilize her kingdom. And in fact, better than that, she was able to get land concessions as a result. But the reason why the Romans ended up taking over Egypt was that Octavian, a very wily, shrewd, nasty, aggressive politician. We've got lots of those in our country, in the United Kingdom, lots of them you can think of in different parts of the world, opportunistic, without any scruples or morals, figures that this is an opportunity to add Egypt to Rome's swollen territories. And as a result, is able to corner Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Cleopatra has thrown her lot in with Mark Antony. She likes him because he's a general, he's the darling of the Roman army. We know from one of the texts that he has very lovely legs. He took a great pleasure or great pride in waxing his legs regularly, for those of you who do that, or would like your other half maybe to do that. Take a leaf out of Mark Antony's book. But Octavian pincers them. They die either through the snake bite in Cleopatra's case, that's the romantic story, or they commit suicide or they're murdered. And Rome takes over Egypt. And that is the point, literally, where Rome goes from being a republic into an empire. Octavian comes back to Rome and the grateful Senate, now with unlimited food, unlimited cash. We see interest rates collapse. They make Octavian an offer. They say, we are now going to call you Augustus, which means blessed one, or I suppose, you lucky so-and-so. And Augustus, they put in him full power. Initially, he's primus inter pares, the first among equals, like Virat is in the cricket team, but we all know Virat is the boss, right? And at that point, Rome's futures change, and so did those of the Indian Ocean. All to do, not because of one volcano, but because of a series of factors that connect into change in the natural world. Likewise here, you can't come to India and to Tamil Nadu without thinking about the great expansion of the Chola empires. And what the Chola did, better than anybody else in South Asian history, was to understand the importance of climate resilience. So although you might want to look at these wonderful buildings here in Kanchipuram, or this, I'm very proud of this photo that I took. I think this is one of my daughters walking away. She never lets me take her photo. And there's my other daughter over there. We look at these structures and we think about the wealth of the Cholas, that ability to build, like I mentioned, temples, to reward priests, to say thank you for divine protection. But what the Chola did incredibly well was to build water reservoirs, which look less good in Instagram photos. But understanding that there was a need to have a social structure, a legal structure, hierarchical structure, allowed the Cholas to have this extraordinary empire from the 6th, 7th century onwards, of course, on Tanjavur here in Tamil Nadu, but then with the influences heading out eastwards too. Not just to do with negotiating climatic change, but also the Chola were the one thing that all empires need to be. which need to be environmentally lucky. And between about 600, 750, and for about 500, 400 years, we find a very unusual pattern of global climate stability. That's partly to do with, my friends, the volcanoes, but it's partly to do with an unusually warm period. But above all, it's stable. And at the same time that the Chola are busy expanding their culture, religion, art, trade with other parts of the world, we find similar things in other parts of the world. We find Vikings heading from Scandinavia, some of them heading this way to Kiev in Ukraine, down to the Black Sea, onto the Silk Road connections, establishing huge amounts of trade, but also heading westwards across the Atlantic. Not because they want Instagram photos. I don't talk like this, by the way, with my students. I don't know why I talk like this with you. No one's interested in Instagram. The Vikings are not going to explore. They're looking for resources. And the first reason why they push further northwards and find places like Iceland is that fish stocks have moved further north to try and find cooler seas. This is the time of global stability, but of unusual warmth. They then also find things like walrus. Walrus makes fantastic rope hide from their very thick skins. The teeth of the walrus are a very good replacement to ivory. But so these expansions are all happening at the same sort of time to do with taking the benefits of stability, but also looking for new opportunities. Same period, we find explorations into the South Pacific. You can see with my datings here about what's happening when, but the ones you're looking at are the green ones. And all these explorations, normally done by single or double hull boats, quite basic pieces of kit. We now, with amazing new technologies of computer modeling, we know that none of these islands were found by chance. They were all being deliberately looked for, usually for finding places that could be lived in with high levels of water availability. Because you need water to grow crops, and you need water for sanitation, you need water to be able to, for hydration and to drink. So we find these echoes. So when you look at the Chola, compare with the Vikings, compare with South Pacific explorations too. I'm going to gallop forward because I've got still lots to cover in the next 14 minutes. I'll say something about how those climate changes, I mentioned about oil and coal fields and so on. Here, this part of the United States was underwater millions of years ago. And as a result, because the drying out happened very slowly as the levels of the sea rose, these patches in red are the ones that have the best soil capabilities. Chalky, rich, dark earths. And you won't be surprised to know that the places which had the highest number of slaves, enslaved people, shipped across from Africa to come and work on plantations, the distribution was all to the places where those soil chemistry was the richest. Not surprisingly, because you can grow more, better quality in an area that's red than you can in that's light yellow. If you map this to what happens in American presidential elections, there's a direct, not just state by state, but county by county overspill. These red counties are the ones that have changed have dictated the shape of who gets into office in Washington for the last 150 years, since black people and slaves were given the chance not to vote, but to be freed in 1865. So this process of how we can think about how past climate changes have affected the world today can make you think about the revolution and independence in the United States, for example, just coming up to 250 years ago, where one of the reasons why the United States declared independence was because Americans had seen what happened in Bengal with the famine in 1770. Pamphlets were passed around in the colonies in North America saying if the British would allow people to starve to death in one part of the empire, in Bengal, wouldn't they allow this to happen in North America too? The connection of context too with revolution. So here we are signing the Declaration of Independence. Then you find things like, it's the giant Kumbh Mela happening at the moment. In 1815, the last really big volcanic eruption that we've had in the modern era at a place called Tambora in what's now Indonesia. This produced in Europe what's called the year without the summer. Crops failed, prices rose, there was social unrest. In Britain, we had something called the Peterloo Massacre, where the police shot protesters in Manchester, and that led to the granting of more rights and setting Britain on a way to become more democratic. It took another 100 years to be allowed all people to vote, and including women, 100 years later. But that process of change was crucial. This volcanic eruption was so dramatic that it changed weather patterns in Switzerland. In the summer of 1816, a group of English, well, they definitely would be invited to the Chennai Lit for Life. Byron, Shelley, Percy Shelley's wife, Mary Shelley, her famous book, Frankenstein, was written because these writers had all gone to Lake Geneva to have a lovely, pleasant summer, because it's a very pleasant place to be in the summer, Lake Geneva. It rained every day. Grey skies, thunderstorms. So they got completely bored. No iPads, no Instagram. So they sat around writing each other ghost and horror stories. The most famous of which, Frankenstein. Written because of the extraordinary lightning reactions and the storms that feature so heavily in Frankenstein, connected through to this volcanic eruption. What this also did, it changed the biophysical state of the Bay of Bengal and helped spread cholera first into Bengal, but then globally in the 1820s, 1830s, spread by people who are starting to travel more through steamships, becoming cheaper, quicker, faster than ever before. These things are all highly connected to us. So I'm going to keep rushing through. Here in India, here in Madras rather, or Chennai, where you had the Great Famine in 1876 to 78, where here we have at that point, often when you have difficulties with harvests or disasters, they get made worse by stupid decisions made by human beings. We are imperfect as a species, but we can make foolish, stupid decisions. And one of the things that's most important is not the climate emergency, but it's the things that get done that make things much, much worse. It was the same thing in Bengal in the 1940s. Wheat and grain still kept being exported. Here, an image of wheat and food being exported from Madras in the 1870s at a time where people were starving to death in their, not thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, but in their millions. So thinking about human capacity to understand what's going on around them and to provide emergency disaster planning is absolutely critical for the modern day. Because I'm going to say something about that now and finish. And I will try and finish on an upbeat, positive note, but I'm going to give you some bad news first, right? This behind me is a picture of global mean surface temperatures over the last 150 years. And you don't need to take my word for it. I mean, anybody who doesn't take my word for it, maybe you have a different kind of calculator to 99.9% of all scientists. But we are living in a world that's becoming hotter and hotter and hotter. We are now at the highest temperatures globally averaged for the last 800,000 years. No human has ever lived in a world as warm as ours. Last year was the hottest year on record, and this is extremely hot in almost every single part of the world. We here in Chennai, in India, you've seen some of the consequences already. Severe heat waves, far greater than anything that we might remember from our childhood and our youths. It's not just anecdotal, you can measure this stuff, right? So we have record ocean temperatures, now global oceans, overall, including the Antarctic and the Arctic, average global seawater temperatures are about 15 or 16 degrees, which is a perfectly okay swimming temperature. We had water temperatures off the coast of Florida last year at 37 degrees centigrade. That is warmer than a hot tub or a hot bath, right? That impacts food supplies, that impacts fish. We see by measuring big fish, small fish, fish schools pushing away from the equator to cooler waters. We find fish and other animal life in the sea living further lower down. That changes whole sets of food supplies as well as animal kingdoms and hierarchies. This stuff is tricky. On top of that, we have atmospheric carbon dioxide levels that we have announcement this week putting us on 426, which is the highest level of carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere for, well, most of my colleagues think 3 million years, but a new study thinks somewhere between maybe 10 to 16 million years ago. So these are unprecedented. And why I showed you that picture of the frozen Earth at the beginning that looked like the moon is because we are a biological species. We're an animal. I wasn't taught that in history lessons. I was taught about great men and occasionally about awful men. I wasn't taught very much about women. I'm glad that has changed. But I wasn't taught about the building blocks of history, about calories, about clean air, about water, about farming. I was taught about great things that great people seem to do off the top of their, to their own abilities, rather than how do you negotiate the world around us. And when you take it to your starting point, that 99.9% of all things ever to have lived on this earth are extinct, the odds are against us, unless we can use our ingenuity and our brain power to stay ahead of shaping that world around us. Some of this is to do with natural patterns, but a lot of it isn't. Here's the sea surface temperatures that I mentioned. Again, that rise has been dramatic and constant. This is where we were. This was released this week. Copernicus, which is the European Union Study Centre for Climate Change, looking at global surface temperatures for December. And it's not just that it's gone up dramatically, it's gone up quickly. That's the challenge. Dealing with change is hard. Here in India, you had temperatures at 50 degrees. Some of us think it was even higher than 50 degrees. But for legislation reasons here in India, 50 degrees is a cutoff point because it's unsafe. In fact, the truth is it's unsafe much lower temperatures than that. Anything above 30, 32 starts to present cognitive problems, challenges for people, particularly for young people, brain development. So keeping ourselves cool, keeping ourselves productive, it's a real challenge for governments around the world. How do you get people to work in conditions that are safe and sustainable? But you know about that here in India. The heat that doesn't just affect your biology and makes life difficult or harder for us, it also is unfair because if you are wealthy, you can afford air conditioning units, you can afford a fridge, you can afford ice, you can find ways of coping, but it creates high levels of inequality. I've only picked examples here from India because I'm here with you, but it's the same story all over the world. On top of that, we find these big freak events happening more and more regularly, big hurricanes, mega droughts. This is a paper that came out last night when I was on the plane on my way here. We don't think enough about the different kinds of world we're living in. So AI currently already creates more greenhouse gases, more global warming than the entire airline industry put together. These new technologies that will help us in lots of different ways to understand big storms that are coming, how to deal with mega droughts. Everything is connected, and we need to better understand that. The ways in which we have these billion-dollar events of damages goes up and up and up. In China, water shortage, absolutely critical problem, as it has been here in India too. Global deforestation rates have slowed down, but here, in terms of mammal species lost over the last 300 years, you can see the decline has been rapid. So these ways in which we're changing the world around us here, statistics from India about forest land being diverted. It's not the same in every single province, but there are challenges around how to deal with a changing world. Land being lost, cutting trees down, cutting forest land to build, for example, big new cities. Our global populations, it's great that there are more of us alive than any point before. That's largely because of improved medical care and healthcare, and that's largely because of the ways in which science finally has worked out how to help women. That's why there are more of us, because mothers don't die giving birth, and children don't die when they're born in such numbers as they did before. We're not yet there in terms of improvements, but that's been a fundamental part of it. But as we start to live in bigger cities, the ways in which we live or choose to live challenge the environment around us too. So here in India, of the most 100 polluted cities on Earth, 46 of them are in India, 42 in China. There's a theme to this. None of them in Belgium or Norway or England, countries that industrialized early. How to find a way through to having climate and pollution equalities is an absolutely key question in policy. What does that mean? Well, those pollution levels are not just bad for you to breathe. It's not just difficult if you have asthma like I do, where the first thing I had to do is take my inhaler to stabilize me. This is the change in life expectancy because of poor air quality here in South Asia. These dark areas mean that people live here on average 6 years less than they would do otherwise. You're better off down here in the south, but still, on average, people in Tamil Nadu are living 3 years less than they otherwise would do because of air quality. How to regulate those, how to deliver industrial growth while cleaning your air is not easy. Here you have, of course, water stress, and I will rush through these. You will maybe want to talk about those, the demands of how that's going to perform. But here in Chennai, you know the challenges are not just about too much water or too little. The challenge here in Chennai is both. It's both. So you've had chronic flooding last year, and flooding which may get worse as a result of climate change. We have to be ready for heavy rain, says your mayor. But 5 years ago, you didn't have any water. Here the worry was that you'd reach day zero, a point where water would run out, Already, I mean, even now in Chennai, about 80% of all water is packaged and processed. Cities that are not sustainable reach all sorts of different challenges and consequences, from the Indus Valley through to great cities in the past like Panjikent, one of the pearls of the Silk Road that failed in around about the 6th century. Overexhaustion of natural resources is a key problem in human histories. How one prepares for that, how one mitigates it, how one understands it is absolutely crucial. The difficulty is when you have both things to be worrying about and dealing with. Here, just on my way here this afternoon, I checked the air quality levels here in Chennai. We're currently particle 2.5. These are small little particles that come as a result of exhaust pipes, burning of fossil fuels, from tires. When the tires turn on the road, they move little bits of debris. Currently today here in Chennai, we're at 57 per meter cubed. And the World Health Organization deems the level that's safe as 5. 5. So it's not so close. Here, the daily overall AQI, which is the air quality index, we're at 104. Anything below 50 is good. Anything above that starts to become more difficult. At least we're in the orange and not in the red or worse. So here I have some good news, right? Most people, there are one or two people I'm not going to mention, possibly one of them is going to become president on Monday, who doesn't believe in climate change, don't think that these natural changes are a problem. But most of us do. Most of us recognize that the reason to become renewable is not just about energy security, not having to rely on pipelines and disruption. It's about changing the structure of the world around us, trying to improve where we are, trying to live within our ecological limits rather than push them too far. At the moment, here on Earth, according to a UK government report published 2 years ago, between us, we use 1.6 times the world's resources every year that are sustainable. And like borrowing too much money or owing too much to the bank, if you spend more than you have, one day there are consequences. At the moment, you could make the case that we're doing quite well. There are new technologies that will help us. The renewable transition will help us too. But the first thing is to engage with the history of the past and the importance of the natural world and of different ways in which societies before us have understood it, negotiated it, and thought about it. So many of you will be here today for a lecture about history. If you love history, if you want to know about past civilizations, about the Chola, about Indus Valley, about Vikings, about Mughals, about the ways in which that natural world has shaped us and shaped history, if you want to understand, for example, that Nazis in the Second World War didn't just have views about racial purity, they had views about ecological purity too. Hitler talking about how Germany would become the most beautiful, greenest country on earth. These kinds of things. Please read my book. If you're interested in policy, if you're interested in investment, if you're interested in entrepreneurship, then also please read my book because that will help you better understand where we've come from and also where we might go next. So I'm not here to promise you what tomorrow might look like, but where history is really helpful is to join lots of dots together and to take us away from the things we learned about in the classroom about great men, as I mentioned, but to think about things that when you mention it, where does our food come from? Where does our water come from? How do we adapt? Which societies have been successful in the past at being stable? What happens when you have shocks that don't bring you down, when the Nile floods and you don't have problems? How have states managed to do that? There's so much we can learn from the past. So my book is quite long, 700 pages, but it's 4.5 billion years. I can't remember how many rupees it is, but I know that my publisher have got the price wrong, so it's much too low, because this took me 30 years to write. So I think I worked out that in the UK hardback, it costs about 50p per 250 million years, which doesn't make me feel like I'm getting good value from my day job. Anyway, on that note, if anybody's got any questions, I would love to hear first from some young people. But thank you very much for coming today.
Mr. Peter Frankopan, thank you so much. You took us in a time travel machine.
Yes.
On a journey across periods, across countries.
Yes.
Interconnecting histories and drawing connections to the present. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure there'll be questions from the audience. We have some time for question answers. Yes.
Is there anybody here who's under the age of 21 who would like to ask a question? Because they should go first to open the batting. Okay, wave vigorously. Are you under 21? 20. Okay, I'll take one from somebody. Sir, can we take one from somebody who's young first? Thank you. Please, go ahead. And why don't we take 3 at a time? Otherwise, I'll give long answers by mistake. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I
Is it
can.
working? All right, sure. So, with your historical research, what insights could you provide about current geopolitical tensions and the global challenges we're facing?
Great. Good question. Let's take 3 at the same time. Sir.
Thank you for Earth Transform and Silk Roads. Excellent books.
Thank you.
With the kind of wealth of data that you have, can you historians, top historians, work with the new computing technologies and predict the next zoonotic viruses-based pandemics?
Great.
Can you?
Yes.
Please.
Is there a third one? Yeah. Are there any women who'd like to ask a question? By any chance? Okay, we'll take one here. Who else? Keep waving so I can see you. Yeah, gentleman here. What do I think about migration and transforming Earth? Okay, right. What can historians learn about geopolitics? They can learn a lot. Can anybody in here tell me the name of a single Chinese pop star or film star? Okay, that's why we don't understand geopolitics, right? It doesn't just have to be smart-ass historians living in libraries. If you don't look and ask very basic questions, then it's impossible to take anybody seriously. Policy by PowerPoint is easy, but to understand parts of the world, you need to invest in thinking about them. So, for example, 10 days ago, Indonesia, the most populous Muslim country on earth, population of 230 million, joined the BRICS group that India is part of, right? What does that mean? What do the BRICS mean? How does India see its role within the BRICS? Geopolitics is pointless if you don't spend time in these countries, learn about their past and presence, and to speak to people on the ground. So history can help a lot. Zoonotic diseases is something I spend quite a bit of my time on at the moment. I did an event with Sarah Gilbert, who was the lead of the Oxford University vaccine, that was called the AstraZeneca vaccine. We did a discussion a few months ago. Her view is that we're worse prepared today for a new pandemic than we were in 2020, which is, we were really badly prepared then. So zoonotic jumps at the moment. I'm spending some time working on H5N1 virus that has affected every single dairy herd in the United States, has zoonotically jumped, has claimed human lives, and it's in the open. So we are going to face these again, and they may be worse than coronavirus. There are lots of ways in which we can respond better. One of those is through global cooperation and medical care. One is involving the tech companies better. All of us in this room, does anybody not have a smartphone in this room? Okay, young people not allowed. Okay, most of us have smartphones. There are all ways in which we can use technologies to help spread our early warning systems better than we did. That was a real failure in 2020. So yes, there are. Then migration. The question is, how can migration help us understand the world? It depends slightly what you want to hear. So we think migration is a really big challenge today, but we have the same proportion of the world's population who are migrants today than were in 1960. There are just a lot more of us today, but it's always 3%. Most migration comes from countries if it's through necessity, it goes to the neighboring country, 85% moves to the neighboring country, and then we'll move back. So for example, in Pakistan, there are about 2 million refugees from Afghanistan who moved there in 1979, who are still there. And same in places like Jordan, Lebanon, displaced peoples in the Middle East. Most people want to go back to their home. When you have people who want to move to different parts of the world, it tends to be for a conscious economic purpose, because your labor earns more, let's say in the UK or in UAE, than it does here in Tamil Nadu. And often that's a decision that is taken by a family as a whole. Not always by men, but often it's about male migration. And then quite often, ironically, what happens is that the money that's earned abroad, because it's a higher value than here back at home, that helps raise social equality back here, because money gets sent back to the family from the worker abroad. So a lot of economic migration helps with international development. India's remittances from abroad, from Indians living outside this country, sending money back, is a hugely important part of India's economy. So migration, in my world, doesn't have the same dirty name and dirty word that a lot of politicians talk about, but it's about labor availability. And one of the things that's unusual in today's world is that many right-wing governments, or center-right governments, want to block migration, even though blocking migration pushes up unproductivity, pushes up wage costs, and has a burden on corporations, companies' profitability and growth. But we're in a world where migration is an easy thing for a politician to talk about in order to win votes, without usually understanding it. Right, we got time for 3 more?
Yes.
I've
we
got
have
4 minutes
four-
and 38
minutes
seconds.
left.
I'm playing this like a T20, short answers. Who's got some questions? I'd love to hear from many women in the audience. Yes, a lady here.
Hello.
The lady here first.
Hello.
Just shout.
Sir, thank you for mostly Prince's time.
I'm going to take a lady first so we have a little bit of equality in this room. Yes. Here it comes.
My question is, climate change narratives are more often than not, apocalyptical narratives. So is
They're
there-
often the what?
an apocalyptical narrative.
Okay.
So, can you think of some other genre? Do you think there are any other genre, to where language or climate change can be used in another, perhaps in a positive way?
Okay, great. Who was talking before? Oh, is the lady here? Yes?
Hello. Yeah. Just a generic question. Is there a possibility to do a projection for conflict per degree rise in temperature?
Gosh, I love coming to Cheddar. The reason I'm going to write another book is so I can get invited back here. These are great questions. Thank you. And then the third one, yes.
Why do many
Hello?
people refer to research like yours as eco-terrorism? Or has not politics much to do with this kind? For example, when the pipeline connecting Germany to Russia was blasted, the American and Western media portrayed it as a Russian terrorism. But the New York Times Pulitzer-winning Seymour Hersh says it's done by American and their agents.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
who are we to believe?
Okay.
Mr. Frankopan, we have one last question coming in from here. from
Yes,
the
where's,
first
could you
row.
wave so I can see you when you ask? It's always nice to see. Where's the question?
In the first
Oh, yes.
row.
Oh, gosh, okay. These are going to be tricky, all of these, yeah.
Sir, one more question. So asked in top.
Excuse me,
Yes,
sir,
yes.
just a minute, please. There's a question coming in from here. Please hold.
Yeah, okay.
The same question I asked you earlier in the Speaker's Lounge about the Indus Valley civilization. Your thoughts on what happened to it. It lasted a pretty long time.
Yes.
And what are the factors, including climate or environmental change? And the second follow-up question is, any advice for the Indian cricket team, the test team, which is now at a low point because of...
Okay, I'll do those probably in reverse order. Indian cricket team, well, I've read here, I'm a cricket devotee, I've read that, as perhaps not for the first time in history, that people have been blamed for the performance in Australia, the women and the wives, which doesn't seem to me the normal way in which one would assign blame. I think India was very unlucky. Virat didn't perform as well as he could do for, he's getting older, maybe that's why. Rohit and KL, it's just these things sometimes happen. Looking at, as an Englishman, if I could support any other team that wasn't England, India would be my top one, right? So I think you had an unlucky series in Australia, and, I'm really looking forward to the summer where the Indian team come to the UK, but never write off a team led by Jasprit Bumrah. So that's a very nice question. And also, I suspect they're not going to take my advice anyway. For Indus Valley, yes, it's very interesting to me, as I mentioned before, the ways in which house sizes and house locations changes in Indus Valley. And that's partly to do with the Saraswati, partly to do with the ways in which river navigations change. It means that the unpredictability of where the best land is means that society needs to be much more fluid. So in Indus Valley, you find much lower levels of hierarchy, lower levels of monumental buildings. You find a way in which society seems to function in a slightly different way. There are the parallels which work a bit like that, like in West Africa, and it's partly because the Indus Valley has a much greater envelope of land to exploit. So in lots of these other places, as populations start to rise, the pressure becomes on the best land. So Indus starts to flower as a result. There's a whole set of explanations why there's change. One of the sort of common narratives is that there's a climate reorganization about 4,000 years ago, and that there is some evidence for that. But climate never is the main driver it's always one factor amongst several, if not many. In the case of Indus Valley and the sort of sagging, because empires, unlike, have you all seen Star Wars? Star Wars, people think empires end like the Death Star that gets blown up. And then it turns out, in fact, that was the first Star Wars film I saw. It turns out there are hundreds of sequels, and you can never get rid of the evil empire. anyway, but empires, they tend to suffocate. And in Indus Valley, you have a slow degradation of population size through dispersal. There's evidence of disease, probably some form of pathogen, possibly plague. We're still doing some tests on some of the DNA materials on that. There's a collapse of global trading networks. There's a reason you live in Chennai, because if you live in Chennai or in a big city, your chance to get chai or milk or meat or crisps or meet your friends is very high. If they start to change because there's less availability, people move. And so there's an outflows of population, probably connected to trade failures. So it's not just Indus on its own, it's connections to Mesopotamia. But those replacements also happen that we can see through genetic materials. There's a wave of very heavy migration that comes from Central Asia, the Eurasian plains of Yamnaya. And that connection of Indian history with the heart of the world, of the arrivals of Aryan peoples, of Sanskrit as a written language, like with the Kushan and Kanishka the Great, as with the Mughals, this symbiosis of India looking north is something that's really important. And Indus Valley is the first really major indicator of that one. Then I had this lady here about conflict and climate change. Yes, we're very worried about that. A warming world is very closely correlated to rising levels of violence, partly because as we get warmer, we become more volatile. That's measurable. The number of fights outside nightclubs, shops, etc., rises. Causation and correlation are not always the same thing, but it stands to reason to me that as resources get tougher, food availability, for example, that chances of tension will likely go up. What that looks like, I don't know, but my colleagues who work in China spend an enormous amount of attention looking at the major transitions of imperial dynasties. All of them have important climate contexts and reorganization moments. So we're worried about what conflict might look like, where and how. For what it's worth, my guess will be that if there are major wars, it will be because of other factors that will get to us before climate change. And when you see nuclear proliferation that's happening at the moment, space race with high levels of ballistic missiles capabilities, ambitions into new territories on the moon, for example, in India too, as well as other countries, then those crossovers for tension are high, and our global governance needs to understand and prepare for all of those. Gentlemen here, your question was about eco-terrorism. Okay, eco-terrorism. Well, I'm with Philippe Sands, who's a British lawyer, in about 2 weeks' time, talking about ecocide as a classified war crime. That's now going to be made a war crime. It's as old as history records it. We find in ancient Greece, armies deliberately cutting down olive trees to affect economic production, burning of crops. These are things that humans have done for a long time. So I think that the ways in which you can try to hurt other people through environmental causes is important. But we're quite good at hurting ourselves, right? Chemical spillages, air pollutions. We don't have to look always to blame other people. It's how do we clear our own backyard. The challenge with climate, with air quality, is that we're all in a global system. So it's not just fixing the air quality in Chennai. It's about fixing much more wider global discussions, which is why the COP discussions, however frustrating they might be, are really important. And then the last question was about narratives. For my book, I read a lot of fiction written in the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s. One of the most important topics that was being written about by really important writers like Jules Verne was about climate change, right? One of the best plots is it's called The Man Who Stole the Climate, right? If you wrote an article and said Elon Musk, I'd believe it, right? You could see that today, and so 130 years ago, people were writing about what happened if you could make the Sahara green. What happened if you could tilt the Earth on its axis and make India cooler and make the poles the warmest places on Earth? And so that interest about a changing world because of industrialization was partly to do with science at the time, realizing that emissions and burning of coal put the same things we're talking about today, pollution, air quality, life expectancies, but also a warming world. Scientists were no fools in the past, understood that this was happening already. But those narratives have been, it's how do you attract public attention? And above all, in a great country like India, how do you encourage people to make that part of a vote when they cast in elections that climate and the environment and clean conditions are as important as the other things that politicians are offering us? Once politicians start to lead with climate, environmental, and ecological in a positive way, then things can work differently. So, I saw a very senior figure in the global climate movement who works with the United States government at the absolute top level this week. And, his view is that this is the greatest moment for global entrepreneurship in history because the prizes are so great. If we can find ways to do proper carbon capture, clean energy, plentiful water, find ways in which we can live sustainably, then that makes our lives better, easier, happier for us all. And, our obligation for the next generation is to leave this planet in at least as good a condition as when we found it. My sadness is, since the day that Sachin made his debut for India, since that day, humans have burnt 50% of all fossil fuels. And I feel old, but it feels to me yesterday that Sachin first played for India. It feels very recent. So we're accelerating our stupidities. And sometimes being a historian, not a politician, can be helpful to explain why fundamentals matter. So the things that I would worry about if I was advising Prime Minister Modi, as I do with lots of governments around the world, is first questions you need to think about are water, food, disease environments, and energy. Those are much more important than trying to fix all the other smaller things that you get, even migration, etc. Fix those fundamentals. When history is just about great rulers or empire building, then you're focusing like Netflix on things that are really fun to study, but sometimes things that are fundamental are even more important.